Tina Funk, how are you today?
Doing great. How are you, Victor?
I'm doing well. I'm just gonna keep it real. I've been in back-to-back meetings and I have been running. I haven't even had a chance to catch my breath. But what I will say, it is good to see you. Thank you for making your way to this. And let's tell for those that are watching live or that will see the recording later how we came to be on this particular show. This is with the Society for Diversity, and I think you were relatively new. Were you a relatively new member? Maybe it was a member orientation, and you
It was
talked
it
to
was a member
Amber.
feedback session with Amber.
Okay, all
Yeah.
right. And you were telling her your story, which we'll get into. And Amber thought that maybe you should talk to my co-chair, Brandy Sparks. By the way, let's send our love to Brandy. She's not feeling well. Otherwise, she'd be on here with us. So let's send her some warm, healing hugs to Brandy. And Brandy
Definitely.
is the co-chair for our Careers and Collaborations community practice, and she thought we may be able to do something together. And you have a great story, so I can't wait to get into that. And why don't we do that right now? You ready to go?
Sure, fire away. Let's
All
go.
right. So let's start out with give us a brief overview of your professional journey. What led you to focus on? One of the things we wanted to talk about was reactivating your network, and I think you did that. So I want to talk about that. And I think you also sought out an executive coach during your job search. So tell us what led up to that, and then a few of those things, and then we'll sort of chop it up and get into some other questions.
Sure. So, for me, the importance of building a network goes back to business school days, where they kind of beat you over the head with that, but
Mhm.
for good reason, as we'll, come to hear. But I actually was in business school and was I actually got pregnant at the end of business school. And so, unlike a lot of people, I did not pivot right into one of those big corporate careers. I actually pivoted into a role as a stay at home mom. And in order to maintain my skill set, to continue engaging in kind of that business world, I actually got involved with a nonprofit organization and helped start a chapter of a nonprofit organization here in Indianapolis. And during that time, I was utilizing my contacts within the volunteer world to really be able to continue to hone my professional skills. So we were hosting events, engaging with speakers, doing outreach for sponsorships, which are all things that I do today. Um, but I started building that network then, and I continued to build on that because I worked after at the local level. I actually then was able to pivot into my first role back as a working professional after spending a couple of years at home. And I did that by going to work for one of the folks that I actually served on the board of directors with. She had reached out to me, asked me when I was thinking about going home, back to the workforce. And I said, my son says it's boring staying at home with mom all day. So I think now's about the time. So I went from that role, then ended up working for the national office of the nonprofit organization. So going from being a volunteer at the chapter role for 6 years, and then ended up working in the national office for a couple of years. And then when they decided that they were going to centralize operations to Texas, moving wasn't really an option for me. So I looked for an opportunity that was local. And I ended up working for Indiana University, which is the organization where I got my MBA from.
Mhm.
So ended up pivoting into a recruiting role for the full-time MBA program, which I did for 9.5 years, traveling all across the US and around the globe to recruit students for that program. And then after about 9.5 years, I decided I really wanted to focus on something that was more direct student specific for the students that were there on campus. And I accepted a role as the Director of Diversity and Inclusion for the graduate programs at Indiana University's Kelley School of Business. And unfortunately, COVID hit about 9 days later.
Mhm.
So ended up having the pandemic transition of planning graduations and things like that via little screen experiences like this,
Mhm.
and really took the opportunity to leverage the experience that I'd had in my volunteer role because that was, working with people all across the region and doing a lot of remote work. Um, I was able to utilize that experience in helping to pivot everything for the university online as well. So, after a couple of years, started to see the trend with DEI being a really going from being a really, really important deal that the university was supporting to seeing the budget not quite being there. And although we were hiring at the dean level role, my role continued to not see quite the support that I thought it should have. And so I started thinking about what I wanted to do next. I had been thinking about pivoting once my son graduated because he is a student at the university, and I thought I'd had about a 3-year runway. But some things happened, and I decided that I was going to make the jump sooner than later. So I'm now serving as a deputy director for a nonprofit organization here in Indianapolis that
Wow.
serves the Latino community.
Awesome. Awesome. Wow. Well, that is a terrific journey. Thanks for taking me through that, man. Just, being, having a baby and, working at home and now in these different roles and traveling. That is just phenomenal. Then COVID, that's a lot going on. And so, what comes to mind is, again, I want to really get into this networking part, because I think a lot of folks that come to our page and that are looking and transitioning to different careers or looking for their next opportunity, I talk to a lot of folks that I coach and talk about networking. So how did you go about reactivating your network? What did you do? What are some of the specific strategies that you found to be effective for you?
Well, first off, I'll say LinkedIn was, a godsend. I had been over the years adding people on LinkedIn, as well as, professionals that I had come into contact with, vendors that I'd worked with. So lucky for me, I didn't have to go much beyond the platform that we're, on right now, because that was where I'd kept a lot of the information, because I find people keep that information up to date more often than they do most other things. So when I was thinking about doing a transition, I had originally thought that maybe I would go into business for myself, do the entrepreneurship route. And so I had connected with a colleague that I had met at a professional development event and really started to have some conversations to flesh that out. But at the same time, I was also interested in possibly looking at going back into the nonprofit space, because that was something that I dearly loved and had a positive experience with. And so I actually was going back to contacts that I had in LinkedIn that were people that I had known since the days that I was, pushing a baby stroller, going to professional development events and things like that. So it was really great to be able to reach out to those contacts and say, I noticed that you have made a transition from working at corporations like Microsoft, for instance, into now working at College Board, or some other folks that I knew that were vendors that I'd worked with that had been in higher ed like myself and had made the transition into the nonprofit space. And I started just having those conversations with people that I had known for, some of them almost 2 decades, or some of
Mhm.
them maybe 10 years. But people who knew me well, knew my strengths, and I think had a really good perspective about what a transition into that field would look like. And so for me, it was about reaching out to people, and it wasn't just a cold call. These were people that, thanks to the beauty of social media, I'd been able to keep in touch with, see where they were, and those sorts of things, and really make those connections. And so the person that I knew that was now at College Board offered up his assistance, was able to give me some internal referrals within his organization. And then the woman that I knew, who was working for a nonprofit organization that had made the transition from higher ed herself, said, our organization isn't hiring, but you might reach out to my husband or consider one of the nonprofits within the Indianapolis area, just because that's what my husband does. And, he might be a really good resource. or you might be able to find something in that space because there are always organizations looking for talent. So so I was actually able to leverage LinkedIn contacts in a really productive way.
Wow. What I find interesting in that, because when I talk to folks about networking, they're, sometimes or oftentimes I'll get a response like, oh, I know I got to do that. But what I think I got from you is that you went to folks that you knew. It's not, going to a room full of folks that you don't know and trying to shake hands and meet people that way, or blind reaching out to people on LinkedIn to try to get a connection and then having a conversation. You went to folks already in your network, people that you've known for quite some time, and I think that's sort of easier traction. It's people you already know. You have something to talk about, and then in that, it sounded like you were able to then talk about what you were looking for, and then that helped pave the way into getting additional referrals to other people you don't know. So you sort of build up for those that maybe are not used to doing that, you could build up your confidence and then make your way to folks that way. So that was what I took out of that. That was very cool, very interesting. Thanks for sharing that. Um, let's see. I understand it. You also had an executive coach,
I
and
did.
so talk to us a little bit about that experience. Why did you do it, and what did you get out of that?
Sure. So it's actually been about a year since I started connecting with the executive coach, maybe a little less. But in my quandary about what I was going to do next, I was really trying to figure that out. And I happen to be very fortunate working at the university. There are a bunch of career coaches that are in graduate career services and undergrad career services. And the way our school worked, many of them were getting certified in executive coaching skills and programs. And so I actually had a colleague who had posted recently about, I'm starting this journey on to become a coach, and I'm looking for some volunteers. And I said, you know what, sign me up. I would love to get some help, really kind of going through this process. And I wanted what I would consider a disinterested third party. And
Mhm.
this is really, really important to me because, we love our family and friends, but sometimes they have vested interests in one, our income, two, sometimes they're emotionally tied to the prestige or the connection of what you do. Sometimes they're like connected in other ways. Like I said, my son is a student at the university, so there's some
Mhm.
additional connection there. And so I wanted somebody that, my colleague, even though she was somebody that I worked with, we weren't direct colleagues. We didn't work together in the same office, and we didn't know each other really well other than from professional roles. And so it was enough of a distance that I felt like I could trust her as a sounding board. I could trust her advice. I knew her background. Um, but also that because she was relatively new to it, she would be really kind of sticking to the script for coaching, and because she was being recorded, so that was also part of it.
Ah,
But it really worked out well for me because for the first exercise that we did, she really had a questionnaire about what are you looking to get out of this experience and those sorts of things. But the real kicker came with the second meeting, and that was she had given me the homework to go and do a values assessment. And I had heard our students go through this experience year after year after year. But as working professionals, we don't take a lot of time to do that kind of thing. But she said, there are all kinds of ways to do this. You can go online and take a digital assessment. You can find a checklist online, find what works for you. And so I actually went online, found a website where they had cards that you could cut out. So basically, you printed out your little paper cards, and you could actually then go through the manual process of sorting. And for me, that was really important. I'm a very visual person, and so laying all of those cards out on the bed while I'm sitting there on my comforter and just going, what are the values that I hold most dear, and what are the things that I feel are, it's like, yes, they're important, but they're not in my top 10. And so, really going through that process as part of the coaching experience, and then talking about my results with her was like the true catalyst to having a successful experience in the job hunt mode, because it really solidified what I wanted to do, how I was going to go through and look at opportunities through the lens of my top 10 values.
Wow. So having I'm just amazed. I've heard some of this. I've heard because we initially talked about it to see how we could help and how we get what you've done out there to our followers on LinkedIn, our listeners for this session. And I just find a couple things so fascinating about that. One is what a golden nugget you found. It turned out this person, I think, reached out to you that they were doing coaching and they were starting out. So that was because coaching can be expensive, but what an interesting way to be able to find getting what you needed, which helped you get in alignment, something that you are familiar with but hadn't done. So because of the
Right.
results of this, it got you to do that. I think that's wonderful. And the thing that I think about, and I tell, I'm in the hotel business and do a lot of work around leadership development. And when I talk to our leaders, I will talk to them about getting a coach. And I think about my experience during COVID, and my job was eliminated. And so here I was, having been in HR for many, many years. And as a part of my package, I got access to a career coach. And while I've coached people, I have had enough forethought that I should do something like that, because in sports, some of the greatest, well, all of the greatest players, if you just pick football, they have in some cases three coaches. Just take a quarterback, they have the head coach, they have a quarterback coach, and they have the offensive coordinator. They have three coaches. And this is quarterbacks that are in the top of their game, right? So I think it's important to have someone to hold you accountable, someone to hold you on track and help you get aligned. I think that's wonderful that you've done that. So kudos for thinking of taking that opportunity.
Well,
Um,
truly, that one was part of, we hear people say it all the time, and we were telling our students all the time about the importance of coaching, but sometimes it's turning that message around and realizing we need to take our own advice.
yeah, 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 very much so. Well, that's terrific. Let's. One of the other things we talked about was being purposeful in your search. So you had this. You knew you had this moment, and that it was time for you to start looking. So what does being purposeful in your outreach mean to you? What does that mean? And how did you apply that in your job search?
So, part of that comes back to those top 10 values. And really, before I would hop online and go digging through what are the latest job listings, I would go back and look at those values, because I was lucky, since I actually keep them in my desk drawer, I had them there to look at. And it was really about, what are the key words that I'm looking for? What are the key things that I'm looking for a company to emphasize? Definitely, that commitment to DEI, since that had been the space that I had been at the university, but it's also something that I've been has been part of my lived experience, is really trying to uphold the values around diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, and justice. Those sorts of things were really important to me. And so I refreshed my lens as I was going in to look at those, job postings. And through that, it really kind of helped me be very intentional, because I know the tendency, especially if you are in that panic moment of, having recently lost a job or realize that your role is not ever going to go where you want it to go, you do kind of get anxious, and you start really wanting to apply to all the things just to see what lands. And as you and I have talked about, sometimes that it does you a disservice. Not only do you look somewhat desperate, because you're feeling somewhat desperate, to be honest, we all know
Yeah.
what that feels like. Um, but also, you're stirring yourself up into a frenzy, because then you're having to keep track of all the different places you've applied to, all the different job postings you've responded to. If you're somebody that is, having to tailor a resume because you're applying to things across multiple industries, you're just adding to your workload, which adds to your stress and anxiety. And that can have some mental health ramifications. And so by really being intentional about, I knew I was looking at nonprofit organizations. I knew I wasn't going to be relocating, so I knew I was looking for a pretty specific area and footprint. And I knew that there were certain types of organizations and missions that were really calling to me. So as part of the Hispanic and Latino community, that was something that was important to me. Having spent years of my life dedicated to education, that was also an arena that I was interested in pursuing. But it was about making sure that I had a real focus and a really specific lens going into the search, and not just looking at all the possibilities. Because I will say, as I'm an from a Myers-Briggs standpoint, I'm an ENFP. From a Keirsey temperament standpoint, I'm an idealist champion, which means I can look at all the possibilities of all the ways I could potentially fill any job out there and drive myself a little crazy.
Yeah. Wow. Well, as someone on the HR side, I will see where I have a handful of open positions, different roles, but I'll have, 5, 6 different positions that are open at a time. And I'll see a candidate that has applied for for all of them or almost all of them. And that does bring about a negative connotation on the recruiting side. So just for you, those of you listening, make be mindful of that. But I think more to your point about for your own mental well-being, I can think of in several years back, 2011, I was pivoting from having my own HR business to getting back into the hotel business. And over a year's time, I had applied for, I don't even want, well, I'll say it, over a couple hundred positions. And I was being mindful about the positions. I really wanted to stay in hospitality, so they were only hospitality related. I wanted them to be in a senior HR role, but that was a couple hundred. And being mindful about what it is like on my side, I still felt a certain kind of way when I didn't get a response, and when I got a thank you but no thank you, and I felt a certain kind of way. And so if you are just doing, and I think you used this term when we talked about it, what was it, spray, when you just
Pray and spray.
spray and spray. And when you have all that and then you get that does sort of drive it down. So you want to really be strategic about what you are applying for, and I think that would be helpful. You also talked about resumes, and you talked about, I think, different resumes, I think is what I heard you say. what
Oh,
are
yes.
the what are the key elements that you think need to be in every resume to stand out for recruiters? I think folks would want to hear about that. What are your thoughts around that?
Well, having done in my long distant past corporate recruiting, and then I did 9.5 years of MBA recruiting, and I have seen so many different resumes from all kinds of industries. And I think the thing that I want to emphasize the most is you want to not drive the recruiter crazy trying to find the basic information. And so
Mhm.
people, to me, this means, no 8-point font, no resume that is so crowded it is hard to read. Most of the people who read a lot of resumes, their vision's going already, so don't make it any
Mhm.
harder than it needs to be. But I talk to my students a lot about the importance of making things left justified. And they're like, "Well, why is that a big deal?" And I said, "Well, if I'm in an interview with you and I have your resume, but I also have the page where I'm taking notes sitting on top of it, if I have everything left justified in that resume, they can still see like all the key pieces while still taking notes on the other side,
Mhm.
or on that sheet that's on the other side." And so it's about making that recruiter's job easier as they're reading through to review your information. Because if they just have to skim the left side to get an idea of your work history, because let's be honest, there are lots of times when recruiters are going into initial interviews or review meetings when they've had a whole 5 minutes to look at your resume. If you can make their job easier to get an idea of you and your experience by doing a quick skim of that left side, you're making your chances of moving on to that next level that much better. Sure, if they've got time, they'll go through and read the rest of it. But the simple things like don't be over wordy, try to use clean bullet points, try to use the action words and measurable outcomes of what you've been able to accomplish in your roles. And those are some things that I think you can find on almost any website. But just clean, legible, make sure you spell check, make sure you check for things. But also, one of those things is have somebody that hasn't been looking at it all day take a look at it, because people become reliant on Microsoft Word to catch every typo. And let's just be honest, there are some things it does not catch. So have your friend that is notorious for being a stickler about all the details go and look over your resume for you before you start sending it out to everybody, and then realize you've had a typo, misspelling, a wrong date in there, a transpose number, one of those things that your brain tends to gloss over after you've looked at it for 60 times.
Yeah. That's great. Well, now and realize everybody, she's a recruiter, right? So she knows what she's talking about there and what folks are looking for. So one thing I'm curious to know, I did this in a couple of instances. I didn't have different types, but I didn't have different resumes for different industries because again, I was really focusing in on hospitality, but I did have two different resumes depending on one that was a little bit more streamlined, easier to read, similar to what you've mentioned. Then I had one with a little bit more detail to it, and it depended on the company and if I knew the person in the company. Did you tailor yours for different roles in any way? Did you do anything like that?
I did very little tailoring, I will be honest. But also because I had a really strong focus. I'd gotten clarity around the industry that I was looking at and some very specific things. But I will say one thing that I did do is as I was looking at the different roles, because if you're applying to multiple nonprofits, they have different emphasis. And so I may go in and reorder the bullet points under certain roles to add priority to things that were more connected to the job posting.
Yeah.
So I'm not reformatting. I'm not doing the whole throw the baby out with the bathwater thing, because that would drive me crazy too. But maybe if they had a strong emphasis on in the role of doing relationship management and development, that kind of stuff got bumped up higher in the bullet points.
Yeah, great
And
strategy.
that's just making the first thing that they read the thing that is most relevant to the role.
Yeah, awesome. Good strategy. Also, speaking of strategy, any other interesting things that you did from a job search perspective that you wanna share? Any job search strategies?
I actually, other than reaching out on LinkedIn, I did look at a few Indeed job postings like most people. But I had a really interesting strategy in that I have a friend who runs a career coaching business, and I followed him on LinkedIn and I followed all the webinars that he was doing and everything else. And he has a newsletter, and I was following that too. And because it was just like, I hadn't been on the other side of the recruiting table in a while. And so I was just like, I need to be refreshing my brain about interview tips and skills. Cause I'm like, it's one thing to be asking the questions, and it's a totally other thing to be on the person who is trying to think about the answers to tell me about a time when.
Yeah.
And so just putting myself in that seat of listening to somebody who was actually sharing that information was really important. And my friend Alan, he has a really great business and does a lot of work with people who are working professionals, as well as people that are, you know, graduate students looking for that very first business career. And as somebody who had weathered all of the various layoffs in the tech industry and various challenges, he was speaking from I've been through this. And I think that's part of also why I'm here today, is I was inspired by what he was sharing and telling about his story of, you know, not everything goes well, but it's about picking yourself up and figuring out how to move forward positively. And that's the reason that I reached out to Amber, how I got connected to you and Brandy, because I said, you know, there are so many people in the DEIB space right now, people that are diversity professionals that just are getting blindsided by some of the things that are happening across various states and in various industries. And I'm like, this is a really relevant topic to talk about, especially for folks, you know, that are in this space right now.
Yeah, and I do want to get to that, but before we get to that, um, you mentioned his first name, but this is an opportunity. Plug your buddy, give your friend some love there. What is Alan's name? There are very few folks that I follow in terms of recruiters. There's one in particular I really love, JT O'Donnell, who's really big on LinkedIn. But this is your time, shine. What's your buddy's name so people can go look him up and check him out?
Well, let me give you the business, because that's one of the first things that you'll want to know. And that is the business is called Kadima Careers. And so they're actually, Kadima Careers is actually like, you know, based out of the East Coast, but they serve people all across the country. And that's something that I think is really, really helpful. They're not just, you know, looking at one location. But my friend's name is Alan Stein. And I happened to meet him at one of those big diversity recruiting conferences that we send our students to. And he had been at National Black MBA. He had been at the Prospanica event. He had done a couple of others. But he's really intentional about reaching out to folks of all different types of backgrounds. He himself is a member of the Jewish community. So, you know, he talked a little bit about the anti-Semitic attitudes that were, you know, being embraced in some areas, and what that was looking like as a challenge for people of the Jewish faith that were looking for job opportunities. So I touched base with him at the conference. We just started chatting back and forth and had kept in connection. But follow Alan. You know, it's ALAN is how he spells it. Alan Stein, and he's just a wealth of knowledge. And, you know, he shares. He's like, you know, I'm an ex-Salesforce, ex-Meta, you know, individual. He's worked at all these different organizations. But he also is very big on the power of networking and how, you know, making those connections and getting those referrals from folks that work at organizations, and how powerful that can be in your job search.
Cool. All right, Alan, I'm going to look you up. And again, I want to get to this, what you talked about in terms of what's been happening with DEI folks. I got a lot to say about that. But the other thing that you mentioned is just about it being stressful and what's been going on. And so from a job search standpoint, we're, you know, folks that are looking to pivot, folks that are looking for their next opportunity, and that can be stressful. What did you do? What did you do during that time for your own self-care during that time, and to help you sort of stay focused and prioritize your well-being?
I will say keeping connections with friends that were going through similar experiences was huge, because it not only helped us to understand each other and our experiences, but also we were the people that could really relate and knew how much the support meant and what was needed. And we were watching each other's campuses or offices with really strong intent. And when things would go really, really sideways for some of our colleagues, reaching out and figuring out, what do we need to do to show up and support?
Yeah. All right. That's great. Thank you for that. What is there anything, and I remember when we talked to you, the first part of the story was like, oh my gosh, wow, this is tough. What's going on? But at the end of your story, you're like, and I'm going to be starting in the next 2 weeks at this role, which was great. So, is there anything though on the front end of that where you were trying to get things figured out? Anything that you would have done differently? Anything that you learned that you would do differently that you want to share with the group?
Um, I will say I probably allowed myself to wallow in the misery for a little bit long. But
Mm,
I have to also look back and give myself some grace on that too, because I was talking about, not leaving an organization that I had just gone to for a job. It was my alma mater. My son went to school there. I'd worked there for more than a decade. There was a lot of emotional identity tied to that. And so, you know, I'm like, yeah, I let it get to me, and I was really in an emotionally bad place for a while. I'll
mm,
admit. But one of the things that really helped me climb out of that, and I think you and I talked about this earlier, was reaching out to friends and colleagues that had known me for a while and say, this isn't about you. This isn't about your work. I've known you for a long time. You're really dedicated to your work. This is really, we've seen how committed you are and how you've been able to deliver. And I got that from coworkers. I got that from friends that I'd reached out to. Like I said, the individuals that I'd reached out to via LinkedIn who'd known me for 2 decades. And I'd also gotten similar feedback from vendors that I had worked with. And we're talking about people that I met through the course of professional work, but they were people that I had really established good relationships with. And I explained to them, that I'm going to be making a transition. I'm looking for new opportunities, and they're like, well, we don't necessarily see everything you do on a day-to-day basis, but you've been a really stellar, supporter of our work. You've really been a good champion for us. And we'd really be, thrilled to support you if we can be a referral or a reference for an interview. Please let us know. And I took him up on it. That was definitely, that was definitely part of the game plan. But just being able to hear from other people that my work was valued and appreciated, and that I hadn't just been in this disbelief that, because that was one of the hardest things, is when things started going awry with my role. I was just like, is there something I'm doing wrong? And
yeah,
I started to blame myself.
yeah.
And it really helped to talk to other people and hear from them that, no, I had been delivering. They thought I had been doing really great work. They really believed in what I was trying to do with my role and with the organization. And so it was nice to be able to hear that external validation, and that's what helped me kind of turn around the spiral that I saw myself on when emotions got the best of me.
Yeah, I think that's great. I give yourself some grace. I will tell you when the pandemic hit, and in the hotel business, we all saw it. Everything was shut down, so we knew restaurants, hotels, and despite me seeing that and knowing that, I was still in my feelings about being told, "Hey, we don't want you. We don't want you here." That's what I heard. That's not what they said, but that's what I heard. We don't want you here. And I was in. It was midweek when I got the call, and I was in my feelings, and I said, I'm gonna be in my feelings all this week and through the weekend, and then Monday I'm gonna get to work and figure out what I'm gonna do next. And I had no idea what I was going to do, knowing that the hotels were shut down, and that's what I love doing. And so I got out of it really quickly. But for those that do, and I heard you loud and clear, right? You were in it a little bit too long, and that would be the one thing you would change, even though you are giving yourself grace, as you should, as we all should, right? So that is great, powerful advice. So thanks for sharing that. Um, any other lessons that were learned during this time, during this journey, that you want to like to share? I think we're getting close to the end. We'll see if there's any questions that may have come through. And I do have one follow. I want to get to this DEI thing, but first, any lessons learned along this way that you want to share with everybody?
Well, I will say, this goes back to learning to take your own advice. But for years, when I traveled around the world doing admissions, recruiting, presentations to prospective graduate students, I was always telling them about the importance of recognizing transferable skills. And, that was one of those things after 12 and a half years in higher ed, I was like, oh my God, how am I going to pivot into something else? But really, it was realizing that if I go back and look at the transferable skills, there is so much that I have done, everything from the event planning, the vendor and partnership management, the engagement with alumni, all of these things that quite easily transition back into nonprofit. And I've been looking at all the things that I've done that I honestly, when I first started looking at it, I didn't realize and make the connection. But even today, in my new role, I was thinking about, because we make decisions about we get grant dollars and we make decisions about who is going to get emergency assistance aid and things like that. And I was like, I've done something similar to this before. And it's really going back to reading application files and combing through every last detail of somebody's application to figure out who's going to get admission and who's going to get financial aid, and making those types of hair splitting decisions. It's the same thing. It's just different. It's just different, different context. So it's really looking at the things you've done and how that it could be applied in a completely different setting, but still use those same skills.
Yeah, I think there's that makes me think of another thing though, because in the hotel business, I talk a lot about transferable skills, but it's tough to get the hiring manager to take that. They want somebody from the industry, they can hit the ground running. And I think that's true in other industries. You get it because you're a recruiter and you can take someone's resume and see, okay, this person is a strong leader, this person's done these things before, and I could make this work in this particular role. You get it. But how do folks that are out there looking, how do they get their point across? There's one thing I know that you did that I will say, but I wonder if there's anything else, because you started talking to folks in that industry you were interested in. So that's obviously building relationships there. Is there anything else, or was that really the main way that you get through when you're trying to pivot into another industry?
Well, it's about that, but also learning to speak the language of the industry.
Mm,
And so that was part of the reason why I talked to folks in the industry, because what we call it in one space, they may call it something else. And so getting familiar back with, oh my God, all the acronyms that get thrown around in different
yeah,
industries, and learning how they talk and about the way they go about talking about different things. And the more you can present your transferable skills in that language, in that context, it's gonna make a difference, because you are demonstrating a familiarity that not everybody is going to have. And so it's coming through those job descriptions. How are they calling this, and what is their terminology? What does the structure look like? Do they call themselves directors and managers, or do they have a different terminology that they use in their titles in their organization? And really just familiarizing yourself with as much as possible about that. It's really gonna make a difference.
yeah, great point. So it's not just learning about the mission statement from the company or looking up the company. It's really understanding the jargon that's used, understanding what the language is. So that is outstanding. That's great.
Yeah,
Uh,
I think one thing was, it was as simple as, what do they call the people that they serve? Are they clients? Are they customers? What is the terminology there? Because subtle things make a difference, because even if people aren't intentionally screening on that, that's actually a bias that comes in. It's like, oh, this person is speaking our language.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, and I think back to when you're networking, one of the things that can help you do that is when you know someone within that organization, you can have these, a virtual coffee and find out more about those things. So that helps you as you're responding, as you were inquiring, and when you get that interview, use that as well. So terrific, terrific. All right. Well, we are. I usually like to try to keep these up to 45 minutes, and then we're out. But I want to hear about. Um, it's I reside in Florida, and it just happened here. Just a few weeks ago, where an entire DEI department was sent out the door, and I have a couple of DEI colleagues that are in education, and something that you said earlier that surprised me was I always just thought that role is on campus, but I heard in your role you were traveling. So I think having a better understanding of the industry is one thing, but specifically around DEI and what's happening in education, what is your thoughts about what's been going on? I got a lot to say about how they folks have co-opted CRT when they didn't really know what it was. Folks started co-opting the word woke. Now they are co-opting and, quite frankly, weaponizing all three, including now DEI, and weaponizing that word. But from your standpoint, for folks that are thinking about whether they should get an education or not, or even nonprofit, or in my field, in corporate world, with what's going on. So what are your thoughts about that?
So, I mean, it all goes back to um, the big thing that is the issue with universities is so many of the universities get funding from the state. So they're vulnerable there, because they're vulnerable to politics, and not just politics on the federal level, but as you've seen in Florida, politics on the local and state level, where laws get passed on what I would say is something of a whim, without real structure or knowledge by the people who are passing those laws about the impact. Like there's a lot of knee-jerk responses happening, and before you know it, there's a law being passed, and culture centers are being shuttered, and DEI offices are being eliminated, and it's just absolute chaos. And unfortunately, the people that get impacted the most are the ones that are most vulnerable on those campuses.
Mm.
And so it's a really sour taste to know that politics can play an ugly role in somebody's education. But that's just where we are. And, we saw in the congressional hearings where we saw the three university presidents go and testify. And next thing we know, a couple of them are without jobs.
Yeah.
And so, and you think about it, it's like if a university president can't keep their position, the folks that are lower on the food chain, aren't going to be much better off. Yes, the presidents are usually the first to go, but then there's going to be ramifications and trickle down. And that all came out of blowback by alumni. And so the thing is, you've got at a university, I don't really care where you are, you're always going to have people who lean right, people who lean left, that are alumni that are big donors. And unfortunately, those big pockets can hold sway over the direction of a university. And, that's something that as a DEI practitioner in a state or private school, you don't have any control over. And so you've got to either develop really thick skin to weather all the storms, or you need to work on your plan B and figure out if something goes awry and does impact you and your role, what are you going to do next? And that's just kind of the reality of where we are.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think that this has just been a wonderful time that we've had. I'm going to take a quick look at LinkedIn and see if we had any questions. I don't see any in the chat, and I just think that with what has been going on, stays. For those of you that are still interested in getting into D&I, or you are already in D&I and you want to continue to do that, I think back to during the pandemic, where I was an HR practitioner, DEI practitioner. I was trying to decide, did I want to just stick to HR or stick to D&I? And I said, I'm gonna, I definitely want to be in the D&I fight. And I'm very fortunate because I hold both titles. I lead the DEI efforts and HR efforts for my company. And I see that with what's been happening now, it won't be long before, they've been doing schools that they will come, start trying to come for corporations. But what I have told folks is that we're going to continue to do the great work that we've been doing. We still want to make sure it's an inclusive environment for everyone, and don't let those, those words, them trying to weaponize that word. As long as you're doing the things that you're supposed to be doing for everyone, you're going to be okay. So I'm taking a quick look, and I don't think, let me just jump on here myself. I don't see any, don't see any questions. So with that, any other, I'll let you have the final words, if anything else you want to say before we close out.
Oh, I think my final thought that I want to leave people with is the folks that do this work, whether we call it DEI or we call it something else, whether you're working at a university or trying to figure out what that next position is going to be, there's opportunity everywhere to work and make a difference. And I made that pivot into, from higher ed into nonprofit. But in our nonprofit, we've got college prep programs for underrepresented students. And I am all about helping those students get as serious as they can and get all the information they need to be successful and compete in that higher ed space. So yes, maybe I'm doing a little bit of an end run around, around the title of DEI, but I really don't care. My mission remains the same, and it's really trying to open doors for people who otherwise wouldn't have those opportunities. So yeah,
Well said.
don't let it change your heart.
Yeah, well said. All right, so shout out to Brandy Starks, who couldn't make it with us today. Sending warm healing hugs to her. I did see her. She moved or put our link out on the careers and collaborations page. So thank you, Brandy. Feel better soon. Regina, it was a pleasure. Thank you so much. Have a great day.
You too, Victor.
All righty. Take care, everybody.